Hey class, today we're going to talk about patriarchy and gender inequalities and the continuity and changes of those in Islam and the other foundational cultures we have learned about. But before we get into all that, let's just talk about Islam on itself or with itself. All right, again, we're going to be looking at changes in attitudes towards gender in Islam, and then we're going to look at a little quick overview of patriarchy and gender inequalities in the other foundational cultures. Again, coming off our last lecture, Islam is an extension of the Abrahamic religion. There are many things that are the same in Islam and Christianity and Judaism, and there are many things that differ. Some things that are same are this Islamic monotheistic tradition of believing in one God, and the founder of this belief is from when God came down and talked to the prophet Abraham. Uh, there's a change in this is just the way that they see their prophets, the way they treat their women. There's also changes in the central figures, such in Christianity. Jesus was kind of like a hippie type character, new philosophies based on the Old Testament of Judaism, where Islam is the leader, Muhammad is more of a political and religious figure combined in one. So before we begin, these are the notes that we're going to be taking right now in your Unit 0 notes. This is the thing that we are going to be going over. The first thing we're going to go over right here is the historian's argument. We're going to practice identifying claims and arguments right now. So finding the historian's argument. Read the introduction and conclusion. Summarize the historian's argument about women in Islam. You could find this by reading this introduction and conclusion. I'll read it out loud, and then after I'm done, you are going to record what you think the historian's argument is in this box here. The women of the nomadic Bedouin, pronounced Bedouin tribes of pre-Islamic Arabia played important roles in their communities. Muhammad, who was raised by a Bedouin family members, experienced the high status women held firsthand. Indeed, teachings and examples set by Muhammad following his revelations reinforced a strong position that by women in early Islamic communities. However, within a century of the death of Muhammad, the strong position enjoyed by women of Arabia had begun to erode. This change occurs in part because of the expansion of the Islamic empires and their adoption of patriarchal civilized traditions. So that's the introduction. You could also find the argument in the conclusion, which says, what seems clear then is that civilization works against the best interests of women. In many non-civilized societies, like the Bedouin, women are able to own property, engage in economic activity, and play important roles in religious ceremonies. It is possible that this is due to the fact that in less civilized societies, women play a much more direct role in the survival of the group. They are instrumental in agriculture and animal raising. As societies become more civilized, this connection erodes, and therefore so does their status and power. So go ahead and press pause and fill out the historian's argument. All right, so was the agricultural revolution really a civilization of society, or did it uncivilize society? Did we really break out of the most optimal way of living and become part of a society where it wasn't equal? Where before we had an egalitarian society, but these new mechanisms that rose due to the agricultural revolution did cause social inequalities, one of them being patriarchy. So the real question of whether the agricultural revolution civilized society is really up to you. And you have to back your ideas up with your own evidence, just like the author should in the previous argument that we read. And again, these are the notes that you are supposed to be filling out. Some of this stuff is review. So, for example, number one, explain the lives and the role of women in Bedouin society. Well, women often played an active role in these nomadic societies. While Bedouin women were by no means considered the equals of men, they were able to marry whomever they wanted, choose occupations that best suited them, and even had the power to influence their clan's decisions. So that was what society was like during the Bedouin society. Post Bedouin society, things change a little bit. I remember these nomadic societies, women were a lot more equal. It was particularly true around areas such as Mecca in this Islamic world, While Bedouin women were by no means considered equals of men, they were able to marry whomever they wanted. They were able to choose their own occupation that best suited them, and they even had the power to influence their clan's decisions. So women were pretty equal and esteemed in the Bedouin society. In Bedouin societies, women were very well respected. Now, this changes after Islam spreads and Muhammad dies. But the important thing to know is that before this, there was an egalitarian society. Now, an example of this would be in Khadija. Okay, Khadija. Now, Khadija was Muhammad's first wife, and she provides an excellent example of the relatively equal status experienced by Bedouin women. Khadija's inherited and managed her father's vibrant trading business after his death. Obviously, then women in Bedouin societies were able to own and inherit property. It also shows us that women could pursue careers in this pre-Bedouin society because she ran her own father's business. Sometimes they even held leadership positions. Khadijah hired Muhammad and he worked under her. She was his first mentor and advisor. After he had worked for her for some time, she asked to marry him. While it was probably not normal for a woman to employ a man or a woman to ask a man to marry her, these acts neither surprised nor scandalized her family or the people of Mecca. Muhammad eventually accepted her proposal, and the two were married. It's also important to note that Khadijah was a widow when she asked Muhammad to marry her. This shows that it was even more acceptable in Bedouin society for women to remarry and the equal gender roles that they were given. And these gender roles were very influential on the teachings and personal behavior of Muhammad, who once said, "Women are the twin halves of men." It is not surprising then that the Quran did much to legalize the strong, but by no means equal status of women. In Islam, there is absolutely no difference between men and women as far as their relationship to Allah is concerned. Both are the same punishment for evil conduct. This idea can be seen in the Surah and the Quran. And for women are rights over men, similar to those of men over women. The Quran also attempted to protect women in more practical worldly matters. For example, it allowed women to become educated, inherit their own property, and it forbade men from treating them poorly. During the life of the Prophet, then Muhammad, and for 1 or 2 centuries after his death, women in the Islamic world enjoyed exceptional opportunities not enjoyed by women in India, China, or Europe at the time. This was before Muhammad's death. Now, why did women's role change within a century after Muhammad's death? We're looking at question 3 now. Well, around the mid 17th century, Muhammad's successor, the powerful caliphs, the Umayyad and the Abbasid caliphates, began to conquer urbanized sedentary populations in the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. And as they did, the culture into which Muslim armies advanced began to take hold and influence Muslims with the caliphates. Basically, guys, these Persian empires and the Islam world started to merge together as their cultures emerged, as their cultures blended. And because of this, Persia was not a nomadic society. So a patriarchy had already lived in their state. So when they merged with Islam, their patriarchal practices blended with Islamic patriarchal practices. Men began to dominate positions of power and had more beneficial occupations. Women in civilized societies became subjected to men and were more confined to the roles of homemakers and childbearers. This is as the Persians and Islam's cultures are merging. From Persia to Byzantium, Muslims adopted the practice of veiling their women. This is when they started. Male ulama began to interpret modesty in the Quran as meaning women should cover mostly, if not all, every piece of skin. And Muslim women became more and more confined to the home. They saw their occupational options decrease and their educational opportunities basically diminish. Again, Muhammad and its followers, before his death, always sought protection for women because the esteemed role women had in Islamic society. Well, why? Well, because they got that from their Bedouin tribes where Muhammad grew up in. He stole the core characteristics and that impacted him greatly. Another person who impacted him was his first wife, Khadijah. Okay. Now, as Islamic armies conquered these urban cities around the Middle East, they had a cultural infusion with other societies like the Persians and the Byzantines, these civilized societies who weren't nomadic. And they eventually adopt their ways of living, specifically the patriarchal practices. They practiced veiling, which was from the Persians and the Byzantines, and they took other cultural things as well. But the big thing that changed women's role was their adoption of uh, the woman's roles in their societies. Now, women's roles weren't changed as much if someone was poor. The big changes come for elite women, the representatives of society who have to show these cultures infusing with each other. Elite women, in particular, experienced increased restrictions on their movement and activities. In the palaces that sprang up in the cities of the Umayyad and the Abbasid caliphates, elite women were often kept in rooms separated from the rest of the house by high walls and gardens. In the places of government officials, the harem was developed. It just means forbidden area and is where officials seclude their wives and concubines. Here they were guarded by the watchful eyes and sharp swords of the eunuchs, which was like a castrated soldiers. When elite women left the house and ventured into the city, they were veiled from head to toe to keep them from prying eyes of unrelated males. They were also often carried in covered sedan. Working class women never experienced this strict protection of cultural values as elite women did, these patriarchal values. Um, Women from poor families had to work to survive. Therefore, at times, they had to leave the house veiled but unchaperoned. Furthermore, whereas elite women often had servants to attend to them and to their daily matters in the home, working class women did not. As a result, poor women also had to work hard in the home. Their domestic duties included cleaning, weaving, rug making, and other crafts that might support the family income. Now, despite these changes in the lives of women in the Middle East, the status of women never really deteriorated. Now, it is important to remember that even though women's role in Islamic society changed greatly and there was inequalities, obviously, within gender, the lives of women in the Middle East and the status of women never deteriorated to the same extent as they did in India, China, or Europe. Because of the need to read the Quran, women continue to be educated. Islamic law preserved many rights for women. For example, the right to inherit and own property, as well as a right to divorce and remarry. These were rights that were not offered to women in other civilized societies. Thus, the strong position women had enjoyed in the Bedouin culture was never really entirely undone by the customs encountered by the Muslims from the Persians as they came to rule these civilized centers in the rest of the Middle East. Indeed, many of these egalitarian practices of the Bedouin culture were built into Islam as it emerged. All right, so the big thing that you guys need to take away from this is what seems to be clear after going through all this is that civilizations work against the best interests of women. In many non-civilized societies like the Bedouin, women are able to own property, engage in economic activity, and play important roles in religious ceremonies. It is possible that this is due to the fact that in less civilized societies, women play a much more direct role in the survival of the group. They are instrumental in agricultural and animal raising. As societies become more complex, this connection between women and the economy and of the group kind of erodes, and therefore so does their status. All right, so we have now gone over the gender roles of men and women in all of our foundational cultures in Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Confucianism. So now you guys are going to use the vocabulary you have posted for on your reading guide for this week, and you're going to use those vocab terms that are linked in the reading guide to fill out this information as proof some of the way women were treated or how genders were treated in each of the. So, for example, if you guys go to your reading guide here, it has the key terms. You're going to use these key terms to better help you fill out these notes. You're also going to need to go back and look at your previous to fill out this graphic organizer. This is a really important one because it's a compare and contrast pretty much. It's going to show you everything, how each foundational culture differed and stayed the same with the way they treated women. So get on that. You guys have until the end of this week to finish all your notes, all your reading questions, and that's pretty much it. If you guys got questions, email me or Mr. Gonzalez.